Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we are going to be continuing with our Series 7 Ontological Arguments for the Existence of God. Today we're going to be looking at objections to the 7th ontological argument we've offered here, the Higher Order Ontological Argument. If you haven't watched my previous video on just the Higher Order Argument in general, you might want to check that out now. What we're going to do in this video is run through the premises of the argument and give some reasons you might want to object to these premises. The premises are as follows. God properties are all properties that God possesses. Any property entailed by other God properties is a God property. Necessary existence, necessary omnipotence, necessary omniscience, and necessary perfect goodness are all God properties. Therefore, God necessarily exists. Let's take a look. So, God properties are all properties that God possesses. In the previous video we said, oh, this is just a definition. Well, alone it may be a definition, but along with premise 3, all we're saying is that God possesses as one of his properties necessary existence. This seems to beg the question, or at the very least it compresses into the modal ontological argument. It begs the question because what we're questioning in this argument is whether or not God exists. So, with a conjunction of 1 and 3 just meaning that we're assuming that God exists, it doesn't seem that we're arguing anything here at all. All we've done is kind of redefine words in premise 3, so it's not really clear that all we're saying is God necessarily exists. Now, if you don't think the modal ontological argument begs the question, you won't agree here, but there's a lot of other reasons that I've given to object to the modal ontological argument. And it's important to note that all this argument really is a beginning of maybe some justification for premise 1 of the modal ontological argument, or at least an attempt to do that. Now, premise 2 and premise 3, there's a couple ways that we can object to this. Either we can claim that God is contingent, that God doesn't necessarily exist or be impossible, that in some possible world God could exist with some of his properties, but not the property of necessary existence. Or we can claim that God properties are not closed under entailment. Let's take a look at what each of those objections would look like. So, God is contingent, but God properties are closed under entailment. This is saying that God exists in some possible worlds, but doesn't exist in all possible worlds. That necessary existence just isn't a God property, basically. That in some possible worlds, sure, God being all good implies that he's all-powerful and implies that he's all-knowing, but it doesn't imply that he has necessary existence. He's just contingent. He exists in some possible world, but not all possible worlds. So, necessary existence just isn't a God property here. Now, there are some people who would claim that God is either impossible or necessary. In this case, you would want to object to the claim that God properties are closed under entailment. Basically, what you would say is, necessary goodness may be instantiated in some possible world, but because it doesn't entail necessary existence, the being that is necessarily good isn't God. Basically, it's saying that necessary goodness can be instantiated in other possible worlds, or goodness can be instantiated in other possible worlds. That necessary goodness being that being in all the worlds in which that being exists is always going to be good. But that being's not going to be God. Why? Because the original thing we walked into this position with was that God is either impossible or necessary. Well, if he's not necessary, he has to be impossible. So we could just say that sure, necessary goodness is instantiated somewhere, but what instantiates it isn't God, because God doesn't exist in this world, so he's not necessary. This is kind of the reverse argument from the position of lacking the belief in God at the beginning. We can also object to premise 3 in another way, such as questioning why these are God properties. What makes these properties God properties? Because a holy book says so, I'm confused as to what we can use to substantiate these properties. And usually, necessary omnipotence doesn't come into effect. It's usually just omnipotence, even if you're relying on a holy book. Because you say they are, and what, importantly, excludes someone from imagining something with different properties that they claim also imply necessary existence. Maybe all the God properties except for necessary perfect goodness. Maybe necessary perfect evilness, or maybe just necessary perfect not caring, one way or another. It seems that this premise doesn't have much to substantiate it. Provide me with a lovely argument for that, and I'd love to speak to you. But until then, this was the objections to the higher order ontological argument. Next up, we are going to be taking a look at some kind of objections to ontological arguments in general and kind of a generic structure that all these arguments seem to take on. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.